A few weeks ago, I got to go to my high school reunion. I was really excited about it. 20 years, I graduated from school in 1997. And while some of you are doing the math to figure out how old I am, 20 years on, we had our high school reunion. I was very excited about it. Most of my school friends were abroad, studying abroad, and so only a few managed to come. There was only about 40 to 50 of us out of 250 who managed to gather together. But barring one of the guys, all the rest of them, I was meeting them after 20 years as well. And Facebook and WhatsApp make it very easy to be in touch without really being in touch. And so it was wonderful to meet up with these guys. Now, I grew up in St. Columbus School. I've said that many times. And St. Columbus is an all-boys school. And so the reunion was an all-boys affair, or all-men affair now, because we're not boys anymore. It was an all-men affair, and the invite strictly said no wives allowed. And so we all got together, a bunch of guys. There was a lot of food. There was a lot of loud music because we forgot that we are nearing 40. And we thought we'd like the loud music, and we left that premises very fast with where the loud music was playing. But along with all that, there was a lot of alcohol, because these guys are all rich business guys and they can afford that much of alcohol. I was just startled with the amount that was spent on the alcohol alone. And as expected, the guys started getting, the intake of the alcohol went up as the evening went on, and I was sitting at this little teetotalers table with a bunch of other guys whose wives had made them promise not to drink. And they were sitting there. One of the guys had made him promise not to drink because he was the designated driver. And so we were sitting and talking, and as the evening wore on, there was this one guy who was a kind of a big guy, and he's in school also. He was one of those guys who picked on the others, and as the drinks took a toll on him, he went back, regressed 20 years to that bully that he was. And he was just picking on different guys, and he came to my table, and he sat down, and he called me Padre. He said, "Padre, today you will drink. Today you have to drink something. I am not going to leave till you drink." And someone shouted, "The alcohol is over. It's finished." And so he picked up a bottle of water and put it in front of me, and he said, "Padre, explain to me. In every religion, God forbids alcohol. Only in yours, your God turned water to alcohol." And then he looked at me and said, "Now you do the same." And I found it hilarious and very interesting, even as I prepared for this series and this sermon that we want to do. I found it wonderful, in fact, that people who have no idea about Jesus, who have no intention to walk with Jesus, that was not a question of help me find faith. It was just, he was mocking the whole thing. But he still knows about Jesus. Somehow he knew that Jesus had turned water to wine. Alcohol was his thing, so he knew that miracle. Maybe he doesn't know anything else. But my landlord has a son who's crippled waist down, and he's gone to churches with his son to ask them to pray. He told me to pray when he found out I'm a pastor. He told me, "Don't preach to me about Jesus, just pray for my son. He doesn't want anything to do with Jesus. He's not got any interest in the faith. Just pray, because I know that Jesus healed." He knew about that miracle. And the world might not want anything to do with Jesus, but they've heard that he is this miracle working person. Maybe you call him God, I don't, but I know that he did miracles. I know that that's something he was famous for. And we want to do this sermon series, 4-part series, that we want to look at the miracles of God, but I want to set it up a little bit for you before we look at today's passage. See, for God by definition, whatever God you believe in, maybe you're here this morning and you don't believe in the God of the Bible, but whatever God you believe in, even if you don't believe in God, the word God by definition means supernatural. By definition, he is not natural, he's supernatural. Now, God being supernatural, to do the supernatural is perfectly natural. Did you follow me? God is supernatural, and so to accomplish the supernatural is perfectly natural for him. So it's not a case of God parting the Red Sea and saying, "Whoa, I didn't know I had that in me. Let's do it again." And so he parted the Jordan. No, that's not why it happened. God, for him, he's not amazed at the supernatural because that's who he is. He's not blown away that he can raise people from the dead because he's the author of life. It doesn't blow his mind when he does the supernatural. It's like if you walked up and said hi to me, I'm not going to start clapping because you spoke. That's a natural thing for you to do. Nobody gives a standing ovation because you opened your mouth. You're natural and you'll do natural things. God is supernatural, and so it's perfectly natural for him to do supernatural things. And so listen to me closely and carefully right now. For God, when it comes to miracles, for God, the miracle is not the reason for the miracle. Because that's something He can do. A miracle is never the reason for the miracle when it comes to God. But it's definitely the reason when it comes to you and me. We pray and we ask God, God heal, God provide. And if God was to answer and say, yeah, but I want to teach you a lesson, you'd be like, if there's any way to not learn the lesson but still have the miracle, I'll take it. Because we just want the miracle, right? There's healing needed. God, just heal. The lessons, we learn later, but healing is what I need right now. I want the miracle is the end all when we ask God for a miracle. But as we enter the season, this series on miracles, you need to know, and you need to settle this already, that Jesus, when He does these miracles, is teaching lessons. He didn't come to perform magic tricks. He didn't come to perform miracles for the sake of the miracle. See, Jesus healed. We know that. But not everybody was healed in Jesus' time. Jesus raised people from the dead, but not every dead person rose again. Jesus walked on water, but Jesus also took the boat. He could have walked everywhere. Why did He get into Peter's boat and stand there and preach? He could have just stood on the water and preached, and everyone would have believed Him. Jesus fed, and today we're going to look at that. Jesus feeding the multitude. He fed the multitudes, but not every hungry mouth was fed during Jesus' time. And so you realize that it's not for the sake of the miracles that Jesus was doing the miracles. He was teaching lessons in all of these. And that's what we want to unpack over the next 4 weeks. Various miracles that He did. Especially we're going to be looking in the book of Mark and using the other Gospels as other camera angles to add to the miracle story. But not about the miracle itself, but to learn lessons about God through these miracles. Today we want to look at Jesus feeding the 4,000. And that's very similar. A lot of the lessons that you learn over there, a lot of the happenings that happened is very similar to Jesus feeding the 5,000. So why are we looking at Mark chapter 8? For two reasons. One, in the fact that it is a repeated miracle, and in the few differences that are there are some valuable lessons to learn. But number two, and actually the more pertinent reason why we picked Mark chapter 8 and Jesus feeding the 4,000 is for Bible literacy. Because a lot of people didn't know He did that. When I told some people this week that I was preaching from Jesus feeding the 4,000, they corrected me and said, Pastor, 5. I was like, no, that's Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 8, He fed 4. And they were like, what? He did it again? And so we thought it's a good time to teach Bible literacy as well. Jesus fed the 4,000. So let me read Mark chapter 8, 1 onwards. Mark chapter 8 verse 1 onwards. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, He called His disciples to Him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away. And His disciples answered Him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And He asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. And He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and He took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, He broke them and gave them to His disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, He said that these also should be set before them, and they ate and were satisfied, and took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. There were about 4,000 people, and He sent them away. And immediately He got into the boat with His disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. There were 4,000 people. In fact, Matthew chapter 15, where this story is also recorded, says 4,000 men, not counting women and children. 2 observations about this story before we learn 2 lessons from this incident. One observation, that it is a great crowd. It is a big, big crowd. Don't imagine us. You have to imagine a massive, massive amount of people that are sitting there. It is a huge crowd. And secondly, it is a hungry crowd. Not just physically hungry. Please notice, they have come from far away to listen to Jesus and to see what Jesus will do. They're a spiritually hungry crowd. They've stuck with Jesus for 3 days. See, in Delhi, you got a bunch of people. I mean, you can prove me true on this one. You just go out, 5 of you, stand and look at the floor. Stand in a circle, look at the road. Within 5 minutes, you'll have a crowd. There'll be a bunch of people around you. It's not that kind of a crowd that's just like, something's happening there. Let's go see what happened. No, these people traveled from far and spent 3 days with Jesus. And so it's a spiritually hungry crowd as well. And in that context, with that crowd sitting before him, after teaching them and doing and performing miracles amongst them, healing people for 3 days, you find the first lesson for this morning. Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, I have compassion on the crowd. You and I, we need to know that God is a deeply compassionate God. In Mark chapter 6, where he talks of Jesus feeding the 5,000, you find the word compassion there again. Where Jesus, the crowd comes to him, he gets off the boat and a crowd gathers around him. And the authors tell us, all the gospel authors tell us of how Jesus was moved when he saw this crowd. He says they were like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus had compassion on them. And so he starts to heal and starts to teach them. And so it is compassion that motivated Jesus to teach them to meet a spiritual need in Mark chapter 6. And it is compassion that motivates Jesus in Mark chapter 8 to meet a physical need. So whether God is meeting a physical need or a spiritual need in your life, the only reason he does that, the motivating factor behind that, is a deeply compassionate heart towards you and towards me. God loves you and loves me. You look up the dictionary meaning of compassion and it has both the words sympathy and empathy somewhere in it. Okay, it's got love and it's got a whole lot of things, but it says God that compassion has got an element of sympathy and empathy in it. What's the difference? Sympathy is feeling bad for you. Empathy is saying, I know what you're going through. Actually understanding what you're feeling and feeling bad for you. It's different. It's richer than sympathy. And God feels both. God looks down from heaven and he sees you and me, whether it's a spiritual need, whether it's a physical need, and God is moved. He sympathizes with you. But because Jesus took on flesh and blood, because of Christmas, as you get into this season, because of Christmas, because God allowed himself to come down to earth and become man, God also can empathize with you and say, I know what it's like. I've been there. I don't just sit from far away and have sympathy and feel pity for you, but I know what it's like. God is deeply compassionate towards you. And you need to settle that in your heart this morning. Don't spend your life one circumstance after another looking and evaluating the circumstance to evaluate whether God is a compassionate God or not. Settle that at the cross. Because it is the compassion of God that allowed Jesus to go to the cross for you and for me when he looked down and saw the deep spiritual need for forgiveness in our heart. It is the compassion of God that moved him to carry the weight of your sin and my sin to the cross. God is compassionate towards you, and you need to understand that at the foot of the cross so that you can step into every day knowing that God is compassionate. Because if you don't do that, then the second lesson will be a hurtful lesson for you. It's a beautiful truth, but it can become a hurtful truth if you've not settled the truth that God is compassionate. Because Jesus goes on to feed the crowd. Now there's a temptation when you look at Jesus feeding the 5,000, Jesus feeding the 4,000. There's a temptation for preachers to look at it and to see this remarkable thing that Jesus did, wherein he had too few resources to meet too great a need around him. Right? That's what happened in both the stories, feeding the 5,000, feeding the 4,000. He's got too few resources in his hand and too great a need around him. And a lot of preachers will say, but look at Jesus. He gave thanks. Gratitude. What an amazing example. When you have not enough to meet such a great need around you, still give thanks. But then, he's Jesus. In fact, in the account of him feeding the 5,000, he says to us, Jesus knew what he was going to do, but he asked the disciples about this food question to test them. And so you got a problem because he's showing gratitude and giving thanks, but yeah, he knew what was about to happen. See, if I also knew that the resources were going to stretch and meet this great need, I'd also be thankful. If I knew the movie and how it ended, then I'd be really grateful for this little moment. But I don't. So it's very easy to say, look at Jesus, so full of gratitude, with nothing in his hand, he gives gratitude to the Father. But he knew. He knew that there would be not just enough to feed the crowd, but 12 baskets left over in one case and 7 baskets left over in the other. And then in that situation, it's really easy to give thanks. But that's not what Jesus was teaching. He wasn't teaching about gratitude in the face of great need and less resources. That's not the lesson in this. What Jesus was teaching, the lesson he was teaching is not only is God a compassionate God, but God is a capable God. God is supremely, sovereignly capable. Because he's showing his authority over nature. Bread and fish. Natural things held together by atoms. And Jesus is showing his authority over the very atom that holds this together. That just by, he doesn't even do any waving of his hands. He doesn't pull out a Harry Potter wand. He does nothing. He just says, go give it. Just tells the disciples, go place it before the people. And just by his decree, the atoms multiply. So that there is enough for everybody. He's showing incredible authority over nature in that moment. It's not about gratitude. It's not about all those other things that you can make the story about. It is about the supreme, sovereign authority of the man at the center of this whole thing. It's declaring that this is a supernatural thing I just did. And the supernatural is the realm of God. He's showing his authority over nature in that moment. He did it when he turned water to wine. He did it when he walked on water. He did it when he calmed the storm. He shows his authority over nature. Incredible authority that he had. But here's where it gets hurtful. Because if God was not capable, then you could excuse God for some of the things that happen. I remember friends of mine who don't believe in God. They started asking me when the whole Nirbhaya incident happened in Delhi. The brutal rape of that girl. They asked me, they were like, Pastor, you say you're a pastor. They said pastor mockingly. You say you believe in God. Now, before those men raped that girl, if God didn't want it to happen, he could have stopped it. Why didn't he stop it? And that's a question that plagues the world today. If God can stop suffering and he doesn't, then what kind of a God is he? See, you'd ask that. That's what Delhi and India is talking about right now. People watch a rape happen. People watch a murder happen. Delhiites especially, we gather around and film it on the phone or we just drive past. Nobody gets up. If you have the power to stop it and you don't stop it, what kind of a person are you? And we attribute that same question to God, saying, if he has the power to stop it and he doesn't stop it, what kind of a God is he? Either he's not capable and then, okay, that makes sense. Okay, fine, my heart is a little better. He's not capable. He couldn't. If he could, he would have, but he didn't and he couldn't. Then it makes sense. But if he can and he doesn't, then we've got a problem. And it becomes a hurtful truth that God is sovereign. But it only gets there if you have not settled the fact that God is compassionate. And so my answer to them was this. I know that God is loving. I know that God is sovereign. And I know it doesn't make sense right now. But I also know this, that when all of history is wrapped up and we stand before the same God, you and I will never be able to say he was either unloving or not sovereign. I don't know how that will happen, but I know it will happen. Just the same way, before the cross, if I lived before the cross and you told me God will be both just and merciful in the same moment, I would have told you, I don't know how. It's not possible to be both just and merciful in the same moment. But we live on this side of the cross and now it makes sense. In similar fashion, on that side of heaven, when we stand, we will be able to say God was both compassionate and capable. And Jesus introduced them that day to a compassionate God and a capable God. But to draw out a lesson, a challenge for us this morning, I want to also look at three kinds of people that were there around him. And if you're in any of those brackets, I want to challenge you to move on from that experience or that way of experiencing God to a richer way of experiencing God. The first kind of person is the Pharisee who was there. Right after the narration of this incident, Matthew and Mark, the two Gospels that record the feeding of the 4,000, they both move into the story of the Pharisees and the Sadducees that corner Jesus. These teachers, keepers of the law, they corner Jesus. And he's just done this remarkable thing, showing off the compassion and the capability of God, showing the supernatural side of him. And they ask him, give us a sign. It's not enough. We want another sign. We want you to do the sign that we are waiting for. Scholars argue about this heavenly sign. They ask for him a sign from heaven. What does it mean? Did it mean an apocalyptic sign? What did it mean? But whatever it was, what Jesus had done so far was not enough. And Jesus looks at them and says, why does this generation keep asking for signs? Nothing will be given to you. And I want to ask you, my brother, my sister, are you sitting here holding out on a beautiful, loving relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ because you're waiting for one more sign? I put before him something, and if he can't do it, then, not worth it. But if he can, then I'll believe. Then definitely I'll believe. Are you holding out on Jesus? Are you holding out on just fully committing yourself to him? Are you holding out from just throwing your weight completely into his arms because you're waiting for one more sign? If you are like that, then like the Pharisees, you'll continue waiting for one more sign. And he'll do something else and you'll wait for one more sign. Because until he dances to your tune, he can't be your God. But he's God. You don't get to decide the dance or the tune. He's God. And it's on his terms that faith happens. And so he tells the Pharisees, truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. The specific signs you're asking for, the tune that you want me to dance to, not happening. You come and watch me for what I do. But there's a second kind of people over there. The crowd. This massive crowd. Now 4,000 men, not counting women and children. Huge. So don't envision this place full of people. No, not. This is big. This is a huge crowd. Talkatora Stadium, just to give you a little bit of perspective. Talkatora Stadium nearby, it seats 3,000 people. They wouldn't have fit. They wouldn't have fit in Talkatora Stadium. This is more Thiagraj Stadium, 8,000 seater. It's more like that. If any of you went to Chris Tomlin concert, the Passion concert a few years ago, something like that. That many people, and Jesus has to feed them. That's the size of the crowd that was there that day. Huge bunch of people. That is all around Jesus. There's 5,000, there's 4,000, there's so many things that Jesus did. But I tell you, in John chapter 6, it talks about feeding the 5,000. It says they came because of the signs. They came to see him. This crowd was there because Jesus was doing the supernatural. But the moment he didn't, they were gone. None of them were there making a stand for Jesus when Pilate sentenced him. Where was this big mob? On that day, all the signs that they benefited from, all the things that Jesus had done in their life. Thank you, that was wonderful. But now I don't have time. Pastor, pray for me. I need a job and only a miracle will get me a job. And so we pray. 5 months down the line, brother, where are you? Not seen you for a while. Pastor, I got that job. God gave it to me miraculously, but now I don't have time. See, the problem with Jesus healing the crippled man, the blind man, is till then they can't be the breadwinner for their family because they're blind or they're crippled. Someone else has to do it. Now Jesus healed me. I don't have that excuse. I got to go work and I can't follow you, Jesus, anymore. Because now I don't have that time on my hand anymore. See, you did the miracle in my life, but now I'm busy. And the crowd has gone. And Jesus goes to the cross alone. The story I began with, as this guy sat before me and said, turn the water to wine. A Catholic friend of mine from my school batch, a Catholic guy, he was drunk, he was high at the same time. He was sitting next to me and he goes, come on, he calls me Sandy. He's like, come on Sandy, do it. And this whole bunch will believe in Jesus. Imagine if I came the next Sunday and said, I've got a whole bunch of believers, they all believe in Jesus. You'd be like, Pastor, no, they don't actually. But that's how we live life very often, right? Why are you following Jesus? Is it because he healed someone? Because he provided a bank need, a financial need? Is that the reason? Is that the greatest thing he's done in your life? Have you forgotten the cross? Have you forgotten the empty grave? Have you forgotten the darkness, the despair of your own sin that has been forgiven? And is your whole following of Jesus only based on the little tidbits of supernatural that come naturally to him? Jesus is aware of this. In John chapter 2 verse 23, it says many at the Passover, many believed in his name. See, we'd get excited. We'd have a mass baptism over there. Many believed in his name because of the signs that they saw. But chapter 2 verse 24, the next verse says, but Jesus didn't commit himself to them because he knew what was in the man's heart. He knew that if I didn't do that sign, they wouldn't believe. And the second kind of person is this crowd. And if you're there following Jesus for the sign, not waiting for another sign, yeah, no, I'm not that bad, I'm following him. But again, it's only because of the signs. You have to ask yourself, have you really understood this Jesus? And the last bunch is the disciples. See, the Pharisees were waiting for a sign. The crowd was there because of the sign. And the disciples somehow just didn't seem to get the sign. God blessed them, and God did bless them. But they somehow just didn't get it. And the whole Gospel of Mark, for all the other narratives it is also a narrative of how the disciples just didn't seem to get it for the most part. Jesus fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? Now there's 4,000, lesser crowd, 4,000, 7 loaves and a few fish. He's got a smaller crowd and more resources. And he looks at the disciples and says, where will we get food? And the disciples says, well, we don't know. Where will anyone get food to feed these people? Someone should have said, just 2 chapters ago, Jesus, just like you just did it. This is a trick. Last time also, you did it to test us. We know how this ends. Nobody thought that for a second. It says, they say, where will anybody get food for this kind of bunch? Nobody thought Jesus. And they didn't get it. Jesus feeds them. He feeds the whole bunch. The Pharisees come and question him after that. And then in verse 14, now they had forgotten to bring bread. Who? The disciples. They're sitting in the boat with this Jesus who multiplied 7 loaves to feed over 4,000 people. And the disciples are sitting there now 12 and Jesus 13. 13 of them, and the disciples are fighting about, we forgot the bread. There's nothing. They only had 1 loaf between the bunch and they're worried about it. And I want to submit to you from that it is highly possible, you can see it here in this story, it is highly possible to be right next to Jesus, to be a witness of the miracle that Jesus does. In fact, to be the channel of the miracle. You're the hands that put the bread before the people. You are the hands that put the fish before the people. You and I can be the channel for the miracle and still, right after that, be people who doubt. And if that's you this morning, then again, come to Jesus. Ask him to give you a memory that remembers the blessings of God. As an old hymn says, count your blessings, name them one by one, and it will amaze you what the Lord has done. But more than anything else, more than any other miracle, more than any other supernatural feat that Jesus achieved, is the cross of Christ. And so I come back to what we began with, the compassionate and capable God. And you need to settle that this morning in your heart, that God is compassionate and that God is capable. And when life doesn't seem to match, it doesn't mean that either of those are untrue. It just means you don't know yet. Trust God who does. And the best place to settle that debate about God being compassionate and capable is the cross of Jesus. Because in the cross you see the incredible compassion of God towards you to forgive your sin. And at the same time you see the capability of God to come up with a plan in which the sin is devastatingly punished, but the sinner is saved. God is compassionate and capable, and the cross is the best argument for that. And so on this morning, the first of this month, as we come around the Lord's table, we want to remember that. We want to celebrate that in Jesus, God is compassionate and capable.